First story, the haunting silence of Black Hollow. The storm was relentless, its howling winds battering the small town of Black Hollow. The power had gone out hours ago, plunging the town into a suffocating darkness that felt alive, pressing against the walls of every home. My name is Ethan Miller, and I live alone in the old house on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet life, one I had grown used to after losing my wife 3 years ago. That night, the darkness felt different. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was an oppressive, heavy presence, as if something was watching, waiting. I lit the few candles I could find, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the silence was deafening. I was sitting in my living room when I first heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the kitchen. It wasn't the sound of rain or the wind. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like fingers drumming on glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I stood and walked toward the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The window above the sink was fogged up, but I could make out the shape of a hand pressed against the glass. It was pale, almost translucent, and far too large to belong to any human. My heart pounded as I backed away, the candlelight flickering violently as if in protest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the continued tapping, growing louder and more insistent. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I turned to grab my flashlight from the counter, but as I did, I heard the creak of the back door. It was locked, or at least it should have been. Slowly, the door swung open, revealing nothing but the inky blackness of the night. The storm had quieted now, the wind dying down to a faint whisper, as if holding its breath. "Ethan." A voice rasped from the shadows. It was low and guttural, yet disturbingly familiar. My blood ran cold as I realized it sounded like my wife. Who are you?" I stammered, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The figure stepped into the dim candlelight. It was her, or at least it looked like her. But her eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. Her skin was pale and stretched too tightly over her bones. "You left me," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You let me die." "No," I choked out, stumbling backward. "You're not real. This isn't real." She, or it, smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin that split her face. "I've come back, Ethan, back to the darkness where you belong." The lights flickered briefly, and for a moment I thought the power might return. But instead, the shadows in the room deepened, twisting and writhing like living things. They wrapped around me, cold and suffocating, pulling me toward her. I screamed, fighting against the unseen force, but it was no use. The shadows dragged me into the blackness, her hollow eyes the last thing I saw before the world disappeared. When the townsfolk found my house the next morning, they said it looked abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years. The candles were melted to stubs, and the back door hung open, swaying gently in the breeze. But the strangest thing was the message scrawled on the fogged kitchen window. "Welcome home, Ethan." Second story, the darkening silence of Raven's Hollow. When I moved to Raven's Hollow, I thought it would be the perfect escape. The town was small, quiet, and nestled in the woods of Maine. Everything I needed for a fresh start. The houses were old and weathered, with large, dark trees surrounding everything, their twisted branches scratching the sky. I rented a small house on the outskirts, just past the abandoned sawmill, where the forest seemed to reach its fingers closer every day. The locals didn't seem unfriendly, but they kept to themselves. "Winter's tough here," one of them mentioned, her voice tight. "The power goes out a lot." It didn't take long for me to experience it firsthand. It started on a cold, windswept evening. The lights flickered, then went out completely. At first, it was just the absence of light, but then came the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of the country. It was thick, suffocating, like the air itself had frozen. Even the wind outside had stopped. Then I heard it, 3 slow knocks on my door. I didn't move, telling myself it was just the wind or someone playing a trick. But when I looked through the peephole, there was nothing but darkness. The snow outside was undisturbed, except for a set of bare footprints leading up to my door. The next morning, I asked around in town. One man at the diner just shook his head when I mentioned the footprints. "Don't go looking for answers," he muttered, looking uncomfortable. "It's better to let some things stay buried." I tried to brush it off, but the strange occurrences kept happening. The power outages continued, and every time the same thing followed, the heavy silence and the knocking. I began to feel like something was watching me. The house was no longer just a home, it felt like a trap. One night, the knocking was different. This time, it was coming from inside the house. I ran to the basement and locked the door behind me. It was the only place that felt safe, even though I knew the safety was only in my head. For hours, I sat in the dark, clutching a knife and waiting for the dawn that never came. The silence was too deep, the shadows too thick. Then came the voice, soft, rasping. My name. I turned, the beam from my flashlight trembling in my hand, and saw it. A figure, twisted and wrong, standing in the corner of the basement, its empty eyes locked onto mine. "I've been waiting," it whispered. They found the house weeks later. My car was still parked outside, the keys left in the ignition. In the basement, my flashlight lay on the floor, its bulb shattered, but I was gone, vanished without a trace. Now, Raven's Hollow has a new story. They say if you're in town on a cold, quiet night, you might hear it. My voice, lost in the wind, calling out just before the silence falls again. Third story. The darkness beneath Ashford. It began with a faint hum, the kind that lingers just at the edge of your awareness. At first, I thought it was the fridge motor, or maybe the old AC unit rattling as usual. But when the lights flickered, then went out entirely, I knew something was wrong. Ashford was a small town, the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened. The streets were quiet, the people kind, and the nights always seemed to stretch on forever with nothing more than the distant sound of crickets to keep you company. But that night, something changed. I had just returned from the store, my bags in hand, when the power went out. The streetlights dimmed, one by one, leaving only the pale light of the moon to cast long shadows across the pavement. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was just a brief glitch. But then the silence hit. Complete and utter silence. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. I made my way up the steps to my apartment, fumbling for my keys in the dark. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, a cold gust of air rushed past me, even though the windows were all shut. The temperature had dropped, and it felt like something had followed me in. I flicked on the flashlight app on my phone and scanned the room, but everything seemed normal, nothing out of place. But that nagging feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I turned on a few candles, hoping the soft light would calm my nerves. It didn't. The hum came again. Closer this time, vibrating through the walls. I froze. It wasn't the fridge or the AC. It was something else, something deeper, like it was coming from beneath the earth itself. I crept to the window and peered out, but all I saw was darkness. The entire town was plunged into a deep, unnatural blackness, not a single light on anywhere. I called the power company, but the lines were dead. I tried texting my neighbor, but the messages wouldn't send. Panic crept up my spine. This was more than just a power outage. Then I heard it. A voice. Faint, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it wasn't the wind. It was coming from inside the building. I moved to the hallway, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. As I stepped forward, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It was a name. Maggie. I froze, my heart pounding. No one in this town knew my full name, except for my late father. He used to call me Maggie when I was little, before he passed away years ago. The whispering grew louder, now echoing through the entire apartment. My legs moved on their own, pulling me down the hall, deeper into the darkness. The further I went, the colder it became. The floor creaked under my feet. The walls seemed to groan with a terrible pressure. And then I saw it, a shadow, moving against the grain of the room, shifting in a way that no human could. It was tall, lanky, with limbs too long, and a face that was barely there, just empty, hollow eyes staring directly at me. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something alive. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The darkness closed in, swallowing up the light from my phone, leaving me blind and alone in the presence of whatever this thing was. I turned to run, but the floor beneath me gave way, and I fell, tumbling down into the abyss. The last thing I remember was the whisper again, clearer now, as if it was inside my head. "Maggie, you shouldn't have come back." When I woke, I was in a place I didn't recognize, cold, damp, and suffocating. The walls were made of stone, and the air was thick with decay. It was the town beneath Ashford, a hidden place forgotten by time. And then I saw the others. Hundreds of them, all standing in the shadows, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They were like me, trapped, lost, taken by the darkness, and they were waiting for the next blackout.